bad.
What's up? What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Rendes, also known as Ricky Rendes, and a great episode for you today. Today we have returning guest, one of the most published doctors in the world, also one of the most famous doctors in the world, but he put everything on the line his whole career to get the truth out during the COVID pandemic. He's one of the many guests that I can say I had on before Joe Rogan, and even after all that, I'm super grateful that he still finds time to come on the Ripple Effect Podcast. And he actually made an appearance on the Union of the Unwanted, my other roundtable discussion show I host, on the day that he was on Joe Rogan for the first time. And if you haven't yet figured out who I'm talking about, it's Dr. Peter McCullough. And he joins me with author, historian, and philosopher, Dr. John Leake. And they joined us to talk about the brand new book called Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. And that book and all the research that went into it is the focus of our discussion today. Prior to COVID, I did tons of shows on this topic. I had amazing guests on like Dr. Brian Hooker, Del Bigtree, Dr. Andrew Wakefield, Dr. James Lyons Wheeler. Then, of course, I had amazing doctors on like Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Jessica Rose during the COVID pandemic. But it has been a while since I've hit on this topic, and I'm sure I have many new listeners. So I'm sure you're going to get some new information. And it's an interesting conversation because we have Dr. Peter McCullough, which will give you the science and doctor's perspective on vaccines. Then we have Dr. John Leake, which will give you the philosopher and historian perspective on the history of vaccines. So it's a very fascinating conversation. Of course, before we get into this, I have to remind you, this is a value for value show. If you get any value out of the discussions and guests I bring to you, please consider giving some value back. It doesn't have to be financial. You can rate, review, comment, subscribe to the Ripple Effect Podcast on all the video and audio platforms we're on, and we're on a bunch of them like YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, iTunes, Minds, BitChute, and many more. And of course, you can find all these links and much more at therippleeffectpodcast.com or in the show description. You'll also find links to how to support the show financially if you're in a good financial situation. We have a PayPal account, a Venmo account, and a crypto wallet if you want to send a one-time donation. We also have a Patreon page if you want to support us monthly, and that's one of the best ways of supporting us. And then also we have a merch store and some sponsors, but definitely check out the merch store. We have hoodies, t-shirts, hats, mugs, stickers, a couple new logos and designs just released and a couple more coming. And you can find that on my website or in the show description, or you can go directly to the merch store by going to the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. And of course, you can also find all our sponsors in the show description and on my website. And that's it. Enjoy this amazing conversation with Dr. Peter McCullough and Dr. John Leake. And I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.
It's so great to be back on the program, The Ripple Effect, with Ricky Rendes. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. I'm in practice here in Dallas as an internist, a cardiologist. I'm a research epidemiologist. I'm president of the McCullough Foundation. I'm also the chief scientific officer of the Wellness Company. So I look after patients every day. And it's been a great privilege to work with John Leake, who's considered at this point in time, I think, the world's greatest historian and certainly one of the best authors in the space, trying to help the public understand what's happened through the pandemic. And now I think a very deep dive into this irrational exuberance that we've experienced in the last 5 years or so with vaccines.
Yeah, I'm John Leake. I'm a native Dallasite. Dr. McCullough and I discovered in 2020 that we were basically neighbors. I formerly studied history and philosophy, but my career as a writer began in the genre of true crime, with an emphasis on stories with a lot of forensic scientific and forensic medical components, for which I went pretty deep into the literature of forensic medicine. And when the COVID-19 pandemic first visited our shores in March of 2020, I began to perceive that a lot of what we were being told by our federal health authorities just did not seem plausible to me. Based on my background researching organized crime, racketeering, and some of my experience in forensic medical research. But I knew I needed a top tier academic medical doctor, preferably one who's also treating patients, not just conducting research. I wondered where I might find him. And as luck or providence would have it, Dr. McCullough turned out to be my neighbor in Dallas. So some people think that was providence. Anyway, I contacted him. We published our first book, The Courage to Face COVID-19, in 2022. It was, I would say, part one of really a two-part saga. Part one was the suppression of early treatment for the illness. Never mind vaccination. Like, what do we do with people who are already getting sick? How to keep them out of hospital? How to prevent them from getting gravely ill? That's where Dr. McCullough came in with his very personal and poignant story. Then we began to think, the suppression of early treatment seemed to be paving the way for a much larger agenda. That agenda was made manifest in April of 2020 by Bill Gates. He announced that the world is locked down, the world is frightened, but good news, a vaccine is on the way, and we will be able to go back to normal when everyone on Earth receives the vaccine. Every man, woman, and child receives it. It was a strange thing for me to hear, because remember, this is April of 2020. The vaccine that was heralded by this great herald, Bill Gates, had not yet gone through trials. So it was almost like, fear not, I bring you tidings of great joy. A vaccine is being developed in labs at warp speed. And when it comes, it will save and liberate all of humanity. So that was kind of my initial starting point, was how strange this is, how global it was. And so Dr. McCullough and I started talking back then, like, what do we make of this vaccine enterprise? It seems rather astonishing. So that's where our second book, I think, was born. And we've just now published it about a week ago.
Yeah. So the new book, it's a part of your own personal journey, it seems, in kind of uncovering all the sketchy science and the cover up that is how effective vaccines are. So is it safe to say, like, your opinions on vaccine science has evolved?
Yeah, it's a fair point. We're talking about this book here. I'll try to hold it up, Ricky. Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. It's ranking highly in virtually every category on Amazon right now. And it's not like either one of us had strong opinions about vaccines going into the pandemic. As a medical doctor, vaccines were a part of clinical practice, but not a big part. I'm not a pediatrician. I personally accepted all the vaccines. My children got all the vaccines. I never really thought about it much. But some things did happen, I have to say, and it's in the book. Because one of the things that comes up is you don't really think about vaccine side effects unless somebody in a circle of empathy indeed has a side effect. And I'll never forget, I used to take a flu shot every year. I didn't think too much of it. And one time my brother, who worked for a big investment company, said, yeah, one of his colleagues took a flu shot and got Guillain-Barré syndrome and was essentially paralyzed for the rest of his life. And it just kind of generally dawned on me. I said, wait a minute, there's less than a 1% chance we ever get flu. I've never even tested for flu. Even if I got influenza, there's there's treatment for it. I wouldn't expect it to be such a big deal. Would I risk being paralyzed the rest of my life for a flu shot? No way.
Yeah, I concur with the doctor. I studied medical history as starting as a boy. My step grandfather, my grandmother's second husband, was a Harvard trained physician. He had a huge library of medical history books. I got into it kind of as a just a fascination, a broader fascination with history, intellectual history, how mankind has thought about and conceptualized diseases over the years. In all of those years of studying medical history as a hobbyist, I always just assumed that vaccines were not a controversial subject, that they had been really an extraordinary and unblemished addition to the medical arsenal, a very important one. It was only after the COVID-19 saga and all of the highly questionable things that we were being told about the rapid rollout of the new COVID vaccine, the way it was mandated, the discovery that it doesn't prevent infection and transmission, but we're going to mandate it anyway. I mean, a lot of this just seemed absolutely extraordinary. So Dr. McCullough and I found independently, we began to wonder, well, no, wait a minute. I mean, there's some very strange things going on here. Let's take it back to the beginning of the vaccine enterprise and let's see if there are any insights that can be gleaned from looking at the entire story, from start to finish. And what we discovered in our research is that there's a remarkable continuity of wild experimentation, guesses, and a great deal, this is very disturbing to discover, a great deal of gambling. And I'll let Dr. McCullough talk about his, in August of 2020, without having gone into the history or really thought about this in a broader way, his perception of gambling with Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, Ricky, I don't know if you knew this, but I was the only public figure in the world to put in writing a question about the COVID-19 vaccines. It's almost as if the entire world was in a trance. And by invitation in 2020, I was writing opinion editorials in The Hill, which is a widely read journal for the House, the Senate, and the White House. It's largely an inside the Beltway journal, but my August of 2020 edition, which turned out to be my last, was titled The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Program. And I thought it was a gamble. I thought the vaccines weren't going to work, honestly, just like the flu shot or pneumonia shot. They're just, any of these respiratory diseases, that the vaccines in the arm provide relatively little mucosal immunity in the nose, the mouth, and the lungs. So I really didn't think it was going to work that well. And I saw virtually all the resources for COVID-19 being shifted to the vaccines, where there was a little emphasis or effort on multi-drug treatment protocols. There were advances in nasal sprays and gargles and in vitamins, and none of that was pursued. It's as if the entire world had dropped everything for, really a frontline approach of vaccination.
Okay.
Yeah, even though by the time the vaccine program was rolled out, COVID-19 or the causative agent SARS-CoV-2 had already spread far and wide throughout the entire country. I mean, it was already upon us. I think seroprevalence, the number of people who'd already been exposed to it, who'd already mounted some immune response to it, was already very high before the first shots were rolled out. So there are a lot of things about the COVID-19 vaccine program. And remember, we call it a vaccine, but really it's a novel genetic technology. It's a gene transfer technology using synthetic messenger RNA. A lot of it just seemed like unbridled enthusiasm to try out a new technology with this element of experimentation and gambling on people. And there's a really kind of terrifying, a sort of Stephen King moment in this book that we present in our chapter on the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. It was in October of 2021. There were FDA deliberations about whether to approve it for young people. I mean, it had started off as what we were told is that the disease posed a special risk to older people, but quickly it was, well, we're not just concerned about grandmother or nursing home residents. We actually want to get the kids to take it. And so there was a deliberation, should we approve it for young people? And there was this terrifying moment, very eerie moment, where Dr. Eric Rubin, who's the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, so the top of the heap in academic medicine, he says, we don't really know for sure how this is going to affect young people. He acknowledged a safety signal. There were signals of vaccine-induced myocarditis posing a particular threat to male adolescents. So he acknowledged that risk. He also acknowledged that the risk profile of just severe illness was much different for young people. It was a far lesser risk for young people. But then he says something that I think shall live in infamy in the history of medicine. He says, the fact of the matter is, we won't know how it affects young people until we just start giving it to them. So let's just start injecting them and see what happens. So, I mean, he might as well have just said, let's roll the die. 21st century medicine with a new product. It's just like going to Vegas. Let's just roll the die with the health of the nation's young. So that's when I think, and I remember I met Dr. McCullough for dinner that evening, and he was still flabbergasted when we met for dinner. And that's when we thought, this thing is not science. It's not. It's not a scientific enterprise. It's an article of faith, and it's a demonstration of one's defense of the faith. And that's what we've discovered as we've gone back to the very beginning of this. It has distinct elements of a religious experiment, or religious experience, I should say. And so, we'll start with the perception that this is a sort of gift from God, as Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister in Boston, characterized the first public smallpox inoculation campaign in 1721. This human ingenuity was bestowed upon us from God, and those who receive God's benefaction will be saved, and those who reject it will be doomed. And that kind of religious archetype has persisted throughout the enterprise.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to talk about, just how absurd some of the things they were pushing on the public was that they're also forcing it on pregnant women with no tests on pregnant women. These are the same pregnant women that most doctors will say don't eat sliced meat because of the nitrates, but completely safe to have the COVID vaccine, which is experimental gene therapy, and there's no long-term tests on it. They suppress things like the benefits of breastfeeding, and they force formula on you. So it's like you can see this theme, of like it's always about what profits the companies, not what helps the people. And I do believe that God has given us the medicine to fight all things, but it's I think it's Mother Nature, and it's innate in our bodies. If you give yourself the foods you need, the exercise you need, the love that you need, then your body can handle most things on its own. And instead, they're telling people stay at home, eat Netflix, or watch Netflix, eat snacks and crappy food, but take the vaccine, you'll be fine. So, I mean, as you guys dove deep into the vaccine history, especially John as a historian, like, have you uncovered things like how the vaccine courts, the Simpsonwood meetings, all these like really sketchy things that have happened throughout history of vaccines that led to slowly increasing amounts of vaccines added to the schedule because it's like printing money. If it's put on the CDC schedule, then the government pays for it, and they basically get free money with no liability. Did you start slowly uncovering all these sketchy things that kind of start putting pieces to the puzzle of like this whole, how did we get tricked for so long about this vaccine science that really has very little science behind it?
Yes, as I mentioned before, we go back to the beginning of this with we call it the Great Prelude is part one of the book. It's mankind's contending with smallpox. And so these early inoculation procedures, the first was called variolation. It's from the Latin variola, the Latin word for smallpox. It was just taking infectious matter from an infected patient, making an incision on the healthy patient's arm, rubbing a little bit of infectious matter in the healthy person's arm. The idea was give them a little bit of poison, make them a little bit sick, and that will render them protected from a more severe illness. And that concept really caught on in the 18th century. Then we go to the end of the 18th century to so-called vaccination, and I develop the character of Edward Jenner. He's a very fascinating man, a naturalist and physician at the end of the 18th century in Gloucestershire, England. He had heard these stories of milkmaids in Gloucestershire. We've all heard of Gloucester cheese. It's a dairy region, who had apparently contracted an illness that was similar to smallpox but milder. They would get blisters on their hands, apparently transferred from blisters from the cow's udders. And the story was, and I don't think it rises much above a wives' tale, but the story was these dairy maids who get cowpox, if smallpox subsequently comes through town, they don't get smallpox. It's an interesting naturalist observation. Jenner, who by then is a member of the Royal Society and has some academic authority, he invokes his academic authority and he writes a paper in which he claims to do empirical testing. And so we talk about this. It's a rather humorous and convoluted story, but the upshot is Jenner's idea for inoculating against smallpox using cowpox. This is really the beginning of the true vaccine enterprise. And for those who are interested in etymology, the origin of words, vaccine comes from the Latin word vacca, or cow. So the original vaccine is Jenner's Latin construction variola vaccini, which means literally smallpox of the cow. So when we speak about vaccines, we're talking about that of the cow, which is kind of fun because, you know, what we've discovered is that vaccines are literally the ultimate sacred cow. You know, since it caught on in the 19th century, this idea of vaccination, no one has really been able to challenge this without receiving a lot of blowback. It has become solidified into something like a sacred cow that you can't question. And so, you know, our book is a plea to mankind. Let's get back into the business of questioning this enterprise. We don't have to dismiss it or throw it out altogether. On the contrary, we think there could be real utility, and in some instances, there is real utility in vaccines, but they need to be subjected to more critical evaluation.
Dr. McCullough, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, well, John and I traveled to India, Ricky, and I'll never forget one of the Indian doctors said, you know, we have to be careful in India because we consider vaccines like people and we'd never want to insult them. So don't make any critical comments regarding vaccines, but because you could actually insult the vaccine syringe or the vial. People have taken this on as an article of faith. People get very distraught if you bring it up, particularly those who have taken vaccines. Most of the time they say, you know, they don't want to talk about it. In medical school, there's no critical review of the vaccines at all. We're just told there's a schedule, you have to take it. And then the schedule expands over time. And you put the working example of pregnancy. You know, when my wife had our kids, this was in the 1990s, there were no vaccines for pregnant women. I mean, pregnancy is really the working case for health. In fact, pregnancy is a supernatural state of immunity and health. Pregnant women don't need any assistance. You know, they don't need any special drugs. They certainly don't need vaccines, and they weren't given vaccines, but over the last 25 years, it's crept in that, well, pregnant women should take a flu shot. Again, less than a 1% chance of ever getting flu in anybody. And then pregnant women should take a diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis vaccine. That kind of crept in, even though, you know, I've never even tested an adult for diphtheria or pertussis because we treat bronchitis with azithromycin, which is safe in pregnancy. And then tetanus, with modern obstetrics and clean delivery techniques, there's no risk of neonatal tetanus. And then, before we knew it, the COVID-19 vaccines, within a few months of being released, it was said that, well, they can be given any time during pregnancy, yet not a single pregnant woman was in a clinical trial at the time the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology endorsed their use in pregnancy. And then right during the pandemic, we had the respiratory syncytial virus vaccine approved during pregnancy, in fact, in the third trimester of pregnancy. And so now we have really a bevy of data sources suggesting if you give a pregnant woman a vaccine, it can cause a fever, which for sure all vaccines can do. The fever can trigger a miscarriage in the first trimester, stillbirth in the second trimester, and then a premature delivery of the baby in the third trimester. So now a preemie baby with the risk of brain hemorrhage and pulmonary problems. And it says right in the package insert, for instance, the respiratory syncytial virus vaccine, it says this can cause premature delivery. And so we've seen this promotion of vaccines with what I consider a reckless abandon, meaning there's just no concern over safety. And this has gone on for now a considerable period of time. The people who are promoting the use of vaccines have really no concern on whether or not a baby is lost during pregnancy.
Yeah, and this isn't the COVID vaccine is not the first time we've seen scandals in the vaccine world. You had the swine flu vaccine, right? And then historically, there's a bunch of them. And even if you look at what the vaccine companies, what pharma told Reagan before the vaccine courts, they basically said it's impossible to make 100% safe and effective vaccine. So we basically need, to be removed of all liability. Is that correct?
It's true. And, I spoke earlier about the great prelude, smallpox inoculation and then vaccination. This same pattern we see persisting through the 19th century. We have chapters on Louis Pasteur, who committed documented fraudulent concealment, documented fraudulent misrepresentation about what he was doing. He kept his notebooks, his laboratory notebooks, private. They were only published in the 1960s. So we see this persistent pattern of concealment and misrepresentation. Yes, you mentioned the swine flu of 1976, which is a major act of chicanery, a major act of fraud perpetrated on the entire country. And we see the same pattern that the vaccine manufacturers, they went to Congress, they said, we're predicting there's going to be a virulent flu similar to the Spanish flu that's going to be upon the American people in the autumn of 1976. So this is the summer of 1976, before the flu season commenced. You need to grant us liability protection so that we can hastily develop an influenza vaccine for the predicted outbreak in the fall. You need to give us full liability protection, and you need to give us a guaranteed profit on this project, or we're not going to make it for the American people. So you have politicians who don't really understand what they're being told. They're being told that if you don't fund and grant us liability protection for our flu vaccine, it's going to be on your head when all of the American people come down with the Spanish influenza, a flu of the same virulence as the Spanish influenza, and millions of your constituents die. So that was the representation made by the vaccine companies. And as we document in the book, none of these representations were true. I mean, it's the whole thing is just a grotesque comedy. I mean, they didn't even establish what precisely the influenza virus was that they were purportedly making the vaccine out of. One of the companies made a vaccine out of a completely different variety of a swine flu virus that an American virologist in the 1930s had isolated from nasal secretions of pit. I mean, the whole thing is just a mess. And the heralded horror show pandemic influenza did not actually come to bear. So the whole scare campaign was successful, but the boogeyman never actually emerged. The vaccine manufacturers made a killing. They did not have any liability for it, and it ultimately resulted in at least 500 adjudicated cases of Guillain-Barré, with probably thousands more, and the US government, i.e. the taxpayer, was left on the hook for it. So anyway, that was probably a lot to pack in, but we have a chapter on this. And yet 10 years later, the whole fiasco, which that's not my characterization, the New York Times, 60 Minutes, mainstream media was characterizing the 76 swine flu episode as a fiasco. And yet 10 years later, the same vaccine manufacturers went to Congress. They made the same case. You're going to need to grant us liability protection, or we're not going to make these vaccines. And if we don't make the vaccines, millions will be dead. So Congress fell for the same line of dubious reasoning. And once again, they were granted liability protection. So we talk about all of these things, but it's not, I want to emphasize here, our explication is within the flow of a narrative. We develop the characters. We go into the intrigue, the dramatic conflicts. This is a very human story of arrogance and hubris and pride and a great deal of fraud.
Yeah. And do you guys want to get into the SV40? You guys are familiar with that? It was in the vaccines causes.
Yes, we cover that in our chapter on polio, but I'll let the doctor talk about SV40.
Right. So SV40, the Institute of Medicine actually issued a report on it. What SV40 stands for is simian virus 40. It's a known laboratory accelerator of growth that allows cells to grow and actually can produce vaccines. And what had happened with the polio vaccine, because it was grown on monkey kidney cells, in fact, the polio vaccine, became contaminated with SV40, simian virus 40. And this is relevant because as a kid, I received the polio vaccine, and I received it during the years where the vials were contaminated. So I may have had this injected in me. And the Institute of Medicine, in the end, once the polio vaccine was cleaned up, it issued a report. It said, we can't know how much cancer is going to come out of this, because SV40 is a known proto-oncogene activator. It actually causes or induces cancer. And sure enough, now with Pfizer, Moderna, made in this rushed process, so-called process 2 off of E. coli. Now multiple labs have identified SV40 in both Pfizer and Moderna, the promoter, the enhancer, the origin of replication, even some antibiotic resistant genes, because it's using E. coli circular DNA plasmids to crank out the messenger RNA. It's a complete mess. And this was raised by Florida Surgeon General Joe Ladapo to the CDC and FDA. It's been raised by Dr. Vibeke Manichi in Denmark and all over the world. And not a single country has opened the vials, Ricky, and inspected Pfizer and Moderna for quality, purity, and contaminants. Not a single country. I mean, it's just a mind-boggling reality how governments are showing absolutely no concern over COVID-19 vaccine safety. Not a single country has taken them off the market. In fact, we change out HHS, we change out Alex Azar for Robert F. Kennedy, we change out the entire vaccine advisory panel, and still the COVID-19 vaccines are going strong.
That's actually something I wanted to ask you guys about, was your opinion on the MAHA movement and what they've gotten accomplished, or the lack of what they've gotten accomplished. Is it like, should they get the blame for, I guess, the baby steps in the right direction? Yeah, it seems like we're going in the right direction, but it's like baby steps. We're going very slow. And a lot of people think like, hey, we have these very dangerous products out there. People should have a choice. Like I live in Massachusetts. I've been a vaccine skeptic for a very long time. And when my kids were born in 10 years ago, and my son, and 9 years ago, my daughter, I had a lot of pushback. And then there was a lot of conversations about like, hey, how are we going to go to public schools if they don't let us get a religious exemption, and all these conversations going on. Do you think that these are some of the things that, I'm not saying remove all vaccines for the market, but like giving people religious exemptions, medical exemptions, giving them the choice, the freedom to choose, these type of things should be happening much quicker. And also with, I know there's been some wins with, the COVID vaccine, but with all vaccines, it almost seems like it's taking the back burner. There's not a whole lot of conversations about putting an end to like mandating these vaccines for schools and all, colleges, and really mandating vaccines for people who are typically at their healthiest, which are, young adolescent age people.
Well, Ricky, you're in Massachusetts, and you've already mentioned you have all these constraints. John and I are in Texas, where we have medical, religious, and philosophical exemptions available. Now, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons issued a decree in 2000, 25 years ago, saying that no vaccine or medicine should ever be required to go to school, or the military, or university, or for employment. That there should never be a medical mandate for someone to do a non-medical activity, like, going to school. But yet the requirements have crept in, and we've seen this in the schools. So now people have to seek these exemptions. States like Texas, we have a considerable amount of vaccine freedom, but other states like California, New York, Massachusetts don't. And what's happening is, despite the maneuvering in Washington, what's happened is the public has become aware. Books like ours have made a huge impact. Podcasts like yours are being listened to. And a recent report in JAMA indicates that only 40% of parents plan to fully vaccinate their kids. 60% are expressing doubts. Some have said, like they're not going to do it. And so in response to this, in the last few weeks, the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out with an incredibly vitriolic op-ed in the medical literature saying that all non-medical exemptions should be eliminated across the country. That there should be no religious freedom. If you have an ethical and religious directive in your religion not to take vaccines, like the Amish do, or the Mennonites, and even some of the Orthodox Catholic lineages, that this religious freedom, if you will, should be ignored, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And my read on this is that I think this vaccine ideology, or this field of vaccinology, which is heavily inculcated in pediatrics, I think they're showing signs of desperation. I really do.
In terms of whether MAHA is moving fast enough, there's an interesting chapter that I think bears on this question about the mandate in the United States military for the anthrax vaccine. And we also talk about Louis Pasteur's early adventure and what he claimed was developing an anthrax vaccine for livestock. It proved to be very elusive to make a safe and effective anthrax vaccine for humans, but that didn't stop the United States military from mandating a vaccine that was developed in the 70s for all U.S. service personnel. Okay. In the year 2002, the safety signals on this were dreadful. There was very, very good reason to believe that the so-called Gulf War syndrome, a syndrome of various malaises and very strange symptoms, there was good reason to believe that this was, in fact, linked to the anthrax vaccine mandate. So in the year 2002, there were some very brave U.S. service personnel who challenged this in the courts. And they actually initially started to make some progress. The U.S. military backed off. They said, okay, we'll only mandate it for certain high-risk cohorts, people working in biolabs. There were a few sort of minority cohorts that were still to receive it, but this general mandate was rescinded. And then, shortly after the September the 11th terrorist attacks, a whole slew of letters arrived in the mail at various U.S. congressmen, at their offices, at media editorial offices, contaminated with anthrax spores. A few people died, several people became ill, and this anthrax letter attack, it persuaded Congress and the U.S. Department of Defense to go ahead and reinstate the mandate. So this reinitiated this litigation that ended up going on for years. Now, there's a very intriguing moment in this story that I think a lot of the American people either never really discovered because there was so much distraction and trauma over the September the 11th terrorist attacks into the Twin Towers. But what was ultimately ascertained was the agent who sent the anthrax contaminated letters was not, as initially represented, a terrorist or an agent of Saddam Hussein or bin Laden or some Middle East actor. It was actually a senior scientist in the Department of Defense who felt his life's work in developing anthrax vaccines slipping away. So he took matters into his own hands to show the American people just how much we needed his anthrax vaccine. And so this is just one of many examples of how this attachment to vaccines, this almost fanatical devotion to vaccines, has become pathological. And I mention that this bears on the MAHA story because people seem to think that HHS Secretary Kennedy can just go in with two guns, blazing like in the Wild West, cleaning, a saloon out of bad guys. But I mean, he's up against a very, very formidable, what I would characterize as something akin to a mafia. And, it took 8 years for the anthrax mandate to be rescinded altogether. This worked its way very high into the federal courts. It's not going to be easy to bring common sense and reasonable medical practice to this arena.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think we have gained some ground years ago when I was trying to tell my in-laws and my own family that I wasn't going to vaccinate our kids. I was looked at like I was talking to them about reptilians. I mean, it was like they looked at me like I was crazy. And now even the most, mainstream people seem to be open to the discussion of like, hey, are they really safe and effective? Should we really do it? Should we wait? Should we, and it just seems like it's much more of a mainstream conversation. During COVID, I got kicked off YouTube for many of these discussions. Having that Dr. Brian Hooker on, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Robert Malone, Brooke Jackson, the Pfizer whistleblower. It's just so many different people, and it kicked me off YouTube. I recently just got reinstated. Surprisingly enough, they won't make any revenue, but they at least reinstated me, which is really important because people need to hear these conversations. And I see Dr. Peter McCullough and others on Jimmy Dore and other interviews on YouTube. So it does seem like YouTube, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's because Rumble was slowly blowing up as they censored more on YouTube and people were migrating to Rumble. Maybe it was a money thing. They're like, hey, we can't keep censoring people because little by little, people are migrating to our competitors, or what, or maybe because it's a new presidency and Trump got censored off a lot of these platforms. So maybe they were afraid that if they continue censoring, he was going to come hard on them, hard on just their platforms and the censoring. So I don't know what it is, but it does seem like we're going in the right direction where these are discussions that people are having and are much more open to what for a long time was taboo topics, like asking if there was any relation between autism and vaccines, or, oh, look at all the great things we did with polio and whatnot. Like these are still questions and discussions people have, but they're much more open to it. If somebody, because the two most common things is somebody who isn't skeptical about vaccines, the two most common things you hear is, hey, there's no evidence that autism and vaccines are connected. What would you guys say to that? That, and then also like, hey, look at all the diseases that we don't deal with anymore because of vaccines. Those are like, and polio. I know we've talked a little bit about polio, but that usually is the one that is brought up. Oh, you can thank vaccines for getting rid of polio. Like when people say those typical things, how do you guys handle that?
Well, let's pick up on what you said. You kind of slipped it in, Ricky. Did you say your kids have taken no vaccines whatsoever?
Yeah, no, they've never got a vaccine ever. Neither of them have any allergic. They're not allergic to anything. They have no cognitive issues. They're both star athletes in school and playing sports. And yeah, I'm very proud. And I actually maybe I say it too often, but the reason why I do say it is because when I was going through the discussions with my family, a lot of my family and my in-laws didn't know anybody else who's never vaccinated their kids because it was such a taboo thing to do or at least talk about that people wouldn't say it. And I wanted to like my kids to be examples to other parents who are on the fence that like, hey, your pediatrician will scare you and tell you that you're a horrible parent and all these bad things are going to happen if you don't vaccinate your kids. But here's some example of some kids who haven't been vaccinated and they're more than just fine. And so, yeah, I do. Maybe I should highlight a little bit more, but yeah, I do try to say it anytime I get.
Well, there are a half a dozen studies now, and the most recent one to highlight is by Mawson and colleagues in the Florida Medicaid system, 49,000 children on Medicaid followed out to age 9. And no doubt about it, those who are, by this study, unvaccinated, or at least had no Medicaid visits for vaccines, they have much lower rates of allergic and neuropsychiatric disorders. And allergic is asthma and hives or atopic dermatitis. Neuropsychiatric includes attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, tics, and seizures. So there's no doubt about it. And again, 6 studies show that. So in the modern day, where we're not confronted with the threat of, measles or polio and these other illnesses, if you don't take a vaccine, you certainly can't have any complications. Now, autism is existential at this point in time. I mean, existential. It is the crisis of modern American medicine. Our CDC is reporting 3.2% of all children, according to the CDC network, which has very good definitions. 3.2% of the population has autism. Over 11% have attention deficit disorder. I mean, add those two together, it's 15% of kids with some type of neurologic problem. And then of the kids with autism, 27% have profound autism. They're essentially invalids, head banging, they can't communicate, can't use the bathroom independently. I mean, Ricky, can you imagine your beautiful, healthy kids, one of them being destroyed like this? And so, analyzing this, as an epidemiologist, I would agree, no one knows the cause of autism, but there certainly are risk factors like older parents, premature delivery, and then receiving batteries of vaccines all at once. And John highlighted the case of Dr. Jonathan Poling in our chapter on what's termed intrigue in the court of federal court of claims.
Yeah, I would add, you asked about polio and you asked about this idea that all of these diseases, measles, mumps, and rubella, pertussis, diphtheria, tetanus being the ones that were really talked about for decades. What I would say is vaccines have definitely had utility in reducing morbidity. That is just the number of cases of, let's take measles, for example. So prior to the introduction of the measles vaccine in 1963, basically all American children would get measles. So at first glance, that sounds very frightening, but by the time you get to the decade just prior to the introduction of the measles vaccine, 1963, it's a highly contagious disease, although all American children were getting measles, by then in history, it was a very mild illness. I mean, the case mortality rate was well below 1 in 1,000. I think people will be surprised when they see, we went back and we looked at the US vital statistics for these years roughly between 1930 and 1986. And what we saw is that with things like infectious diseases like measles, the mortality rate, so not just case counts, not the morbidity as a whole, every child that got a measles rash, but I mean children who actually died of measles. By the time you get to 1952, between the years between 52 and 62, the decade before the vaccine was actually introduced, already we were down to around 405 deaths per year attributed to measles. So, I mean, if you compare that to other causes of childhood death, drowning, accidents, car accidents before the introduction of car seats for children, I mean, this was a very, very minor cause of mortality. The other thing, even since 1963, treatment has improved. So to stay on measles, there was a case in West Texas in which an apparently unvaccinated girl contracted measles, and it was presented in the media as, well, she died of measles. Well, we actually investigated this death very closely, and what we discovered is the measles itself, that syndrome was retreating, the rash was clearing up, she was feeling better, but she contracted a secondary bacterial pneumonia that wasn't treated. It was identified on a Monday. She received no treatment until Friday when she was admitted to hospital. By then, it was already a florid case of pneumonia. So had she just received a simple antibiotic prescription, she wouldn't have even gone to hospital. So this is what we're looking at on the mortality side. These illnesses had all become very mild before the vaccine schedule, the modern vaccine schedule, was introduced in 1948. Now, I could talk about polio too. That's kind of considered an outlier in all this. But I think that people, readers rather, are going to be astonished just by how much infectious disease mortality had already dramatically reduced before the advent of the modern vaccine schedule.
And the thing about the adverse reactions, as you guys know, like I think it was Harvard who did this study that that VAR system really only tells you 1% of adverse reactions because most doctors and pediatricians are going to say it's something else, or in some cases you hear stories of these parents being told that, oh, your kid was autistic but you just didn't notice or you weren't aware of it, and even though there's obvious side effect to the vaccine that they received recently. So that happens a lot. I mean, the other thing too is like you think about the mercury, like thimerosal, all these preservatives. If a pediatrician drops a vaccine with mercury in it, they have to call hazmat. So it's like, think about the fact that you're putting that in your body, but you can't handle it. I mean, that's the absurdity of just this, like you said, this religion of being pro-vaccine. How did it, so, because it seems like if you're talking about Oxycontin, if you're talking about, Pfizer and any other, realm of medicine, people are much more skeptical of their motivations. But for some reason, it got so deep rooted in our culture that vaccines was the one place where apparently Big Pharma hired all the really moral people to work at.
Well, remember, a large segment of the population, they don't even purchase the vaccines. Their insurance company doesn't purchase it. It's one of the few medicines that the government provides for you. So, vaccines to the individual are always free. So when things are free, people don't tend to try to value them. And, there's never a complaint that the cost of getting vaccinated was too high. But the vaccines are not fairly presented. The last time I took a flu shot was in 2021. And, they didn't even tell me what flu shot they were using. It was required to be on staff. And ultimately, I got a hold of the package insert. And you know what, Ricky? I got one of the 4% of flu shots that still had the mercury in them. And they finally have gotten mercury out of the flu shot supply. But aluminum is still used, and there's great concerns of aluminum accumulation. I just think it's the sum total of getting many vaccines together, elevating inflammatory factors called cytokines, which readily go into the brain, having an acute reaction, a child getting a fever, sometimes a seizure, or just some tonic-clonic activity, eyes kind of rolling and being paralyzed, called ophthalmos. These are terrifying to parents, and they're not benign. And there's a critical paper by Nielsen and colleagues from Sweden showing if a child has an acute reaction, a febrile seizure like this, there's about a 40% chance they convert to a neuropsychiatric disorder. So the math adds up. There's about 3 to 4% of kids in the United States per year who have a febrile seizure. And if the conversion rate is to autism is at 40%, then there you go. You almost have the autism numbers explained right now. So, we've got to get a handle on this. Autism will consume us. I have autistic adults now in my practice, and it can't just be to do increased recognition because we'd be having an epidemic of new adults with autism. That's not the case. It's just the kids are the ones developing autism, and now they're growing up to be autistic adults.
I know we're tight on time, but one thing I did want you guys to just highlight for the listeners is the difference between the studies done for vaccines and all other pharmaceutical drugs. Has there ever been what you would consider a proper safety study for vaccines?
Not in my view. The FDA says you need at least 2 years of safety observation. Some of these vaccines, I just reviewed, by the way, the chikungunya vaccine, the Vimkunya vaccine, which is for this chikungunya mosquito-borne illness out of China right now. And it turns out, they measured antibodies a few days afterwards. They had some safety evaluation by survey out to 28 days. And after that, they let people call in if they develop complications at 6 months. But nobody's had 2 years of safety data. The genetic products like Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, They should have had actually, at least 5 to 15 years of follow-up. And no, so as I mentioned earlier, safety on vaccines has largely been ignored. There's a religious, irrational exuberance on vaccines. And it seems like, people have to suffer a complication before they wake up to the fact that, maybe it wasn't needed, or maybe for them it wasn't safe.
Yeah, our book, by providing a very detailed and thoroughly documented history, we try to put the risks of life in the modern context into perspective. So, for example, we compare the worst polio year ever recorded before the Salk vaccine was introduced. It was 1952. And in the year 1952, there were 21,000 cases of what was called paralytic polio. It's the most severe manifestation of poliomyelitis. So, of those 21,000, it's varying degrees, mostly lower extremity paralysis, some with transitory lameness, others with the more severe cases with lifelong lameness in the legs. The most extreme cases, and they were the ones that hit the news, were these iron lung cases that terrified everybody. But take 21,000 cases of varying degrees of paralytic polio, and the worst year ever on record. First of all, 10 times more children died in accidents that year. But you would never know it. I mean, the media reporting, it was the first public health scare in the mass media age. 30% of people had a television in that year. So, but compare that 21,000 cases of varying degrees of lower extremity paralysis to what by the CDC's own numbers, we're estimating to be about 275,000 cases today of what's called profound autism. These are profoundly disabled children. As Dr. McCullough mentioned, they can't communicate. They require round-the-clock care. They can't be toilet trained. They bang their heads on the headboard, uncontrollable screaming and agony. There's really, just to put these things in a scale, there's really no comparison between 1952 and where we now stand with profound autism. So what we're asking the American public is we're not trying to diminish the polio vaccine program, which has gotten safer. What we're trying to do is put it into perspective with some of the problems that we're confronted with today. And one of those that I think really needs to be addressed is this epidemic of profound autism. And so that's one of the things that we conclude our book with, that this should really be exhaustively examined and investigated.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you got to think about the motives when they're trying to give newborns hepatitis B shots when you could just test the mother for it and all these things. And then, we've been talking about it, when you see the correlation of autistic rates going up and then also the amount of vaccines in the vaccine schedule slowly going up. I mean, there has to be a correlation there. Obviously, it's not the only thing. I think our quality of food sucks. I don't think we get enough sunlight. I don't think, there's a lot of other issues. I don't think we get enough exercise. Sweating, speaking of aluminum and mercury, sweating is one of the best ways to detox your body, get these things out of you. So there's a lot of, things we can be doing to be proactive and really helping our immune system and helping our health. Also doing things you love, right? Play guitar, right, John? And play guitar and do things you enjoy. I think, the mind and body is connected. And when mentally you feel good, physically you feel good, and vice versa. When you mentally feel like crap, physically you feel like crap. It is connected, and having good energy around you is very important. But so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you guys are super busy, and I can't thank you guys enough for coming on. I really, really
Thank you.
chatting with you guys. Where's the best place to get the book? And if you have anything new or upcoming that you want to promote, please do.
Well, your audience can most easily and swiftly find the book on Amazon. Again, the title, perhaps you'll show it in the show notes: Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. It's only been out for a week. It already has 225-star reviews on Amazon, and people are finding it a very quick and engaging read. So that's your best bet, Amazon.com.
And Ricky, make sure we encourage people to check out our Substack, Focal Points. Focal Points Substack. That's where people get, the up-to-date information on so many topics and issues. We've been on this from the very beginning, and we continue to grow in terms of our readership. For our support, consider the McCullough Foundation, McCulloughFND.org. That supports us in terms of our independent research scholarship, our work on Capitol Hill. And, follow us on social media. We're making a big impact, just like you are, on the ripple effect. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, guys. I even wore my throwback Dirk Nowitzki jersey for you guys.
Well, I thought that was the case. I was going to ask you. I kept looking to see if I could just see the Dallas. There you go. Good job. All right, we got to go. Thanks, Ricky.
Guys, take care.